Okay, so potentially we may have a question, something like comment or analyze the extent to which a reduction in tariffs is beneficial to an economy, or you could be just analysing the effects of this change. Now, what Luke drew the other day was the tariff graph, which looks something like this. So we've got just price and quantity, same as a micrograph. You've got domestic supply and you've got domestic demand, and then we've got world supply over here, which we assume is perfectly elastic, and the original quantity we have, which is Q1 and Q2. And what this gives us is the supply curve domestically is effectively this part, and then the supply curve from the international market would take over at this point. So up until quantity 1, this is where domestic supply, the cost of production is lower than the international cost of production, so the world cost of production. Beyond this point, the world cost of production is less than the domestic cost of production. So up until Q1, the domestic suppliers supply the market, and beyond Q1, international suppliers supply the market. The market price will be at P, which means that some domestic producers gain a producer surplus, but the international producers don't. The current market equilibrium is here, so the total quantity consumed in the domestic market is quantity 2. The tariff itself is a tax on imports, so it will reduce world supply to this level. The increase in the price from the tariff will cause the whole market price to rise, but again, some domestic producers will have a lower cost of production than the world cost of production plus the tariff, so they can increase their supply, and the domestic supply curve kind of is up to this point now, up to Q3. So there is an increase in domestic supply up to Q3. So Q1 was original domestic supply, Q3 is the new domestic supply quantity. And what this also does is it causes the international supply to fall. So there is a fall in imports from Q2 to Q4, and now the world supply takes over at Q3, and that's the world supply line. So what you have is a change in who supplies the market. So originally there is a bit of domestic supply and a lot more of world supply, but now domestic supply has increased and taken some of the world supply, but also some of the world supply has gone, and there's only this kind of small amount left in the middle. So Q4 is the new market equilibrium. And Q2 was the original market equilibrium. Before the tariff. Okay, so we've got the reduction in quantity in total, but within that there is a gain for domestic producers and 2 losses for the importers. One is just a loss that nobody gets, but that increase for domestic producers is at the expense of international producers. And what we also have now is an increase in domestic producer surplus. Okay, now all of this originally, so from P1 to A to B to P, so this shape here, P1, P, A and B, is the loss of consumer surplus on the graph. So domestic consumers are losing out because price is rising and quantities falling. Part of this, so 1, is the gain to the domestic producers, so they gain that producer surplus. 2 is the tariff that the government gets, so 1 is the loss of consumer surplus, 2 is the tariff, which is the quantity in there times the price of the tariff, so it's kind of tariff times the quantity, and that gives the total revenue for the government in this shaded part here. The consumer surplus that nobody gets because domestic consumers are missing out and the importers are missing out is a welfare loss. So 3 and 4, we'll make that 3 and we'll make that 4, is a welfare loss of the tariff. So the benefits to the domestic consumer and the government are greater than the costs to domestic consumers. So it's not an efficient reallocation of resources.